Have you ever noticed how some men seem to have an almost supernatural control over their life? Without chasing fleeting pleasures, without draining themselves in meaningless pursuits, they command respect and create empires. Meanwhile, you feel constantly depleted, always one step behind, wondering what secret they possess that you don't. Most men live as slaves to their impulses, reacting to every trigger, chasing every fleeting desire, draining themselves in pursuits that offer nothing but temporary relief. Meanwhile, a select few, the 1%, have discovered what Carl Jung understood decades ago, that sexual energy is not merely about physical gratification. It is the fundamental life force itself. Perhaps you have never stopped to think about this, but think now. How many times have you felt completely depleted after a sexual release? How many times have you noticed that burst of creativity, that mental clarity, that sense of power when this energy is retained? Jung called this energy libido, and unlike Freud, he saw it as more than just sexual drive. It is the total psychic energy that can be channeled toward any pursuit. But the most striking part is that most men never realize they are in this game. They think they are simply satisfying natural urges, being men, following their instincts. Meanwhile, they are sinking into a psychological field of weakness, scattered focus, and diminished power. They are being manipulated by dynamics they did not create, but now control them utterly. And it's not just about poor choices. Jung made it clear, the greatest dangers don't come from conscious actions, but from unconscious patterns. Most men live alienated from their own psyche, dominated by urges, complexes, and conditioned responses they never question. They are not aware, they are automated. And this automation is silent, it doesn't announce itself. It infiltrates slowly, daily, through small surrenders, momentary pleasures, until you start to doubt your own power. Perhaps you are going through exactly this right now, feeling that something is wrong, that your energy is constantly being drained, that you're not living up to your potential, and perhaps you are blaming external circumstances. The answer is, look within. There is something deeply wrong with the way you are using your most precious resource, your sexual energy. In this video, we will expose one by one the ways that the 1% of men use this energy differently. We will use Jung's concepts and warnings to show you how to recognize and implement these patterns. But more than that, we will show you how to become aware of the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, you have been part of the 99% without even realizing it. Are you ready? Then take a deep breath and focus, but be warned, after hearing this you will no longer be able to look at yourself or your energy the same way again. Imagine having an energy source so powerful it could fuel every aspect of your life. Your work, your creativity, your relationships, your physical strength. Now imagine draining that source every few days for a momentary pleasure that leaves you depleted. This is the reality for most men. They are sitting on a gold mine of power and trading it for pennies of pleasure. Jung said, "What we do not make conscious emerges later as fate." And often this fate instead of directing this energy inward and upward, he aims it outward and downward. This type of man lives in a state of chronic drain. According to Jung, energy is finite, and if unmanaged, it leaves you with nothing to fuel your greatest pursuits. This is exactly what the average man does. He does not see the connection between his sexual habits and his life outcomes. He sees a part of himself and reacts to it as if it were separate from his goals, his ambitions, his destiny. These men often position themselves as victims, never reaching their goals, never having enough energy, never breaking through to the next level. And the worst part is, they never make the connection. But this is where the 1% differ. They understand that sexual energy is not just about sex, it is about life force itself. They see the direct link between how they manage this energy and how they perform in every other area. The 1% are not defined by abstinence. They are defined by conscious choice. They decide when to use this energy and when to transmute it into higher pursuits. Even worse, most men are charming. They have charisma, sexuality, an aura of intensity. This creates a societal trap because you think this is what power looks like. Constant sexual conquest, constant release, constant draining of your energy. But what you are doing in practice is sacrificing your psychic health, trying to live up to an image that ensures you will never rise to the top. Jung warns us that these patterns of unconscious behavior are especially dangerous because they place us in a symbolic role. The eternally adolescent man, forever chasing pleasure, never building anything lasting. And living in this illusion is living half a life. You cease to be seen as a creator and are treated as a consumer of pleasure, of entertainment, of distractions. The only way to protect yourself from this unconscious pattern is to develop awareness. Recognize what is happening, cut the invisible threads that connect you to this cycle of energy depletion, and most importantly, constantly ask yourself if what you are doing is strengthening or weakening your life force. Because the drain doesn't happen violently, it enters through the gap of your unawareness. And once you recognize this pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. In the next section, we will dive deeper into how the 1% specifically channel this energy, and how it manifests in their lives not as sexual prowess, but as an unstoppable, creative and productive force that seems almost supernatural to those who don't understand its source. If this content is making sense to you, prepare yourself. The rabbit hole goes much deeper. Not all power comes from external resources. Sometimes it comes from what seems most natural: your sexual energy, your life force, your vitality. We live in an era of constant depletion, where being is less important than consuming. And this, for Jung, was a serious problem, because when someone identifies too much with their physical urges, the constant need for release, they risk completely disconnecting from their essence. Those who live for the pleasure not only lose themselves, but also begin to diminish everyone around them. Jung states in The Ego and the Unconscious that sexual energy is not only about reproduction, but about creation itself. In other words, it's the same force whether you're creating a child or creating an empire. The problem begins when someone believes sexual energy is only for physical expression. When the energy sticks to the lowest centers and everything that is powerful, creative, and generative is locked in the basement of the psyche. The 1% of men are masters of energy conservation and transmutation. They understand that sexual energy can be redirected upward, toward the heart, creating deeper relationships, the throat, expressing powerful ideas, the mind, solving complex problems, and even the spirit, connecting to something greater than themselves. But while most men chase the momentary high of release, these few cultivate the sustained power of retention and redirection. And worse, the average man projects this demand for constant pleasure onto others as well. He expects everyone to be playing the same game, to fit in, to collaborate with the theater of endless consumption. If you express something outside the script, a desire for more, a commitment to greatness, a willingness to sacrifice temporary pleasure for lasting power, they retreat, become uncomfortable, shut down, because everything that reminds them of what is repressed within becomes unbearable. Jung warned that this type of identification with physical pleasure is one of the greatest threats to the process of individuation, the path of self-knowledge and integration of the unconscious. For him, the real danger begins when the individual is hypnotized by the role they play, believing they are what society has conditioned them to be. And that is exactly where the risk lies. When someone lives only to satisfy urges, recognized, praised, they become a slave to those very urges, and everything that is genuine dies, suffocated behind the veneer of living large. Living among men like this can lead you to doubt your own path. You start to question yourself, measure your choices, hide parts of yourself that don't fit the common narrative. Gradually, you also begin to deplete your energy and don't even notice. Coexisting with the unconscious masses is not just limiting, it is contagious. But there is something even more significant at play, because when someone directs their sexual energy solely toward physical release for too long, they don't just waste it, they deplete their entire system. And then we enter an even more dangerous territory, that of diminished power in all areas of life that returns with emptiness and weakness. In the next section, we will dive into the figure of the 1%, those who have mastered their energy through what Jung called conscious control of the libido. These rare individuals don't deny their sexual nature. They simply direct it with purpose. There exists a type of man who lives with complete control over his energy, always purposeful, always measured, always directed. But behind this appearance of mastery lies a force that most men never experience because they are too busy squandering it. This is the essence of the 1%. Someone who has learned to work with their sexual energy rather than being worked by it. Carl Jung dedicated much of his work to understanding the power of this energy. In On the Ego and the Unconscious, he states, "Libido is psychic energy, which manifests itself in life activities, including sexuality, but not identical with it." What he meant is that this driving force, this fire within, can be directed in many ways. The sexual expression is only one outlet, and for the wise man, it's never the primary one. This type of man does not seem exceptional at first glance. On the contrary, often they appear calm, measured, balanced. But there is something strange about them. They achieve more, create more, influence more. They don't seem to get distracted by the constant sexual noise that derails most men. They have a clarity that comes from channeling rather than depleting. The 1% understand that every ejaculation contains massive energy. Energy that could be writing books, building businesses, creating art, solving problems. It's not that they never release, it's that they do so strategically, consciously, and far less frequently than the average man who responds to every urge like a puppet to strings. Jung was clear. The more you conserve and redirect this energy, the more it becomes available for higher pursuits. You can identify this pattern in men who have extraordinary output, who seem to have inexhaustible reserves, who create while others consume. They are not superhuman. They are simply practicing energy mastery that dates back thousands of years in various traditions. And here is the most important point. Sexual energy is not just about physical power. Jung made it clear that it also contains your creative force, your mental clarity, your powerful will. But when this energy is constantly drained downward, all of this turns into weakness, and this weakness contaminates everything: your work, your relationships, and especially your relationship with yourself. Living as the 99% is like living with a hole in your fuel tank. No matter how much you try to fill it, you are always running on empty. But this depletion does not arise from nowhere. Often it is fed by an illusion of freedom, by the social programming that places constant sexual release as healthy and normal, when in fact it is creating generations of depleted men. This is where we enter the figure of the next type, the sexually disciplined man, someone who doesn't just conserve energy, but redirects it toward greatness. Not every powerful man advertises his methods. Some use ancient wisdom, time-tested approaches, and strategic discipline. They claim to be driven by purpose, vision, and greatness, but deep down they understand a truth that modern society has all but forgotten. Sexual energy is creative energy, and how you use it determines what you will create in this world. Jung was well aware of this principle. For him, when sexual energy is correctly channeled, it becomes one of the most potent forms of psychic power. This is the case of the 1% of men, those who instead of constantly releasing their energy have learned to work with it, direct it, and use it as fuel for their greatest achievements. You have certainly seen someone like this, men who seem to have an unlimited reserve of energy, focus, and drive. They build empires, lead movements, create masterpieces, influence masses, and all while the 99% are distracted, depleted, and wondering why they can't seem to gain momentum in any area of life. Unlike the common man who views sexuality as primarily physical, the 1% understand it as a form of energy that can be sublimated, redirected from physical expression to creative, intellectual, and spiritual pursuits. They don't repress it, which would be unhealthy. They transmute it through specific practices, intense physical training, deep creative work, meditation, breathing techniques, and strategic periods of complete conservation. The problem is that, unlike the unconscious masses, the 1% believe they are doing good for themselves. They genuinely think they are evolving, creating, contributing something meaningful to the world, and this makes their influence even more noticeable because it is rooted in actual results, tangible achievements, and genuine power. In The Ego and the Unconscious, Jung discusses the figure of the higher man as an archetype of wholeness and integration. The 1% embody this ideal not by denying their sexual nature, but by mastering it. They don't project weakness onto others or blame their biology. They take full responsibility for their energy and its direction. This makes them clearer, more focused, and far more effective than those around them. If you observe men who have created something significant in the world, you'll notice they often have unusual sexual discipline, whether they discuss it or not. They may not practice complete abstinence, but they are far from the constant depletion that characterizes most modern men. They treat their sexual energy as sacred, as a resource too valuable to waste, as the very fuel for their greatness. This dynamic is rarely discussed in families, religions, or educational systems where obedience to impulse is confused with liberation. Jung saw this pattern as a real threat to the process of individuation, for where there is excessive release, there is an absence of creative power. The 1% do not want pleasure alone. They want meaning, achievement, and legacy. And when they cannot find examples in the external world, they begin to listen to the internal wisdom that has guided great men throughout history. But the sexually disciplined man is not the only one guided by ancient wisdom. There is another dimension that is even more significant: the creatively transmuting man. While the disciplined conserves, the creatively transmuting man channels his energy into world-changing output. In the next part, we will dive into this explosive territory, where consciousness gains control and sexual energy takes the wheel of creation and achievement. Imagine living with an energy so strong, so vital, so generative, that it can produce not just physical children, but mental and creative offspring that outlive you. This is the reality of the 1% of men who have mastered the art of transmutation, turning sexual energy not just into discipline, but into creation itself. For Jung, creativity and sexuality draw from the same well of energy. In his conception of libido, he saw not just the drive for physical pleasure, but the drive for all creation. The creative man realizes that the same energy that can create a human being can also create a business, a book, a movement, a revolution. It's not different energy, it's different application. You can recognize these men easily. They have an output that seems almost superhuman. They create while others consume. They build while others talk. They achieve while others dream. And beneath it all is a carefully managed reservoir of sexual energy that is directed not downward into momentary pleasure, but upward and outward into lasting creation. Jung saw creativity as sexual energy sublimated, redirected toward higher expression. When a man learns to channel his creative force, he doesn't lose his sexuality. He transcends its limited physical expression. The energy moves up from the root into the heart, throat, mind, and spirit, becoming love, expression, thought, and connection to something greater. Most men never experience this because they are stuck in a cycle of build-up and release, never allowing the energy to accumulate enough to reach these higher centers. They experience creativity as occasional inspiration rather than a constant flow. They live for the weekends rather than creating a life that energizes them every day. In Psychological Types, Jung describes how energy can be directed through different psychological functions: thinking, feeling, intuition, sensation. The creative 1% have learned to consciously direct their sexual energy through all these channels, resulting in work that is not just technically sound, but emotionally resonant, intuitively on point, and physically compelling. The creative transmuter does not deny his sexuality. He alchemizes it. He doesn't fight against his nature. He works with it at a higher level. This is why the most prolific creators often have unusual or disciplined sexual practices, not from moral restriction, but from energetic wisdom. They know what the 99% don't, that energy directed into physical release cannot simultaneously fuel mental creation. But there is something even more powerful than conscious conservation or creative transmutation, and that is spiritual sublimation, the highest use of sexual energy according to Jung and many wisdom traditions. This is the domain of men who don't just create businesses or art, but who create impact on a level that seems almost transcendent. They channel sexual energy not just into doing, but into being, a state of presence, connection, and power that magnetizes others to their vision. Have you ever met someone whose presence alone seemed to command a room? Someone whose ideas spread not through force, but through resonance? Someone who leads not by domination, but by inspiration? This is sexual energy sublimated to its highest form, a charismatic force that seems almost otherworldly to those who don't understand its source. Jung believed that this highest expression of sexual energy connects us to the collective unconscious, the shared reservoir of human wisdom, archetypes, and power. When a man learns to channel his energy to this level, he doesn't just create products, he creates movements. He doesn't just accumulate money, he generates influence. He doesn't just build a business, he leaves a legacy. This is the true definition of the 1%. Not just financial success, though that often follows, but a level of impact that outlives the physical body. While the 99% are driven by the small death of constant release, the 1% are driven by the desire to create something deathless. The path to becoming part of this rare group isn't complicated, but it is difficult. It requires breaking societal programming, developing conscious practices, and committing to a higher purpose than momentary pleasure. It means treating sexual energy as your most precious resource, and directing it with intention rather than surrendering it to impulse. In the final section, we will outline specific practices that the 1% use to manage, direct, and transmute this energy. Practical steps that any man can implement to begin moving from unconscious depletion to conscious creation. Imagine living in a world where you are fully charged, constantly creating and magnetically attractive. Not because you chase these outcomes, but because you've learned to master the fundamental energy that makes them possible. That world is available to any man willing to practice what Jung called the conscious control of instinct, the discipline of directing rather than being directed by your most powerful drive. What separates the 1% from everyone else isn't genetics, luck, or even talent. It's their relationship to energy, specifically sexual energy. They've developed practices that most men have never even considered, let alone implemented. Here are the key methods they use, drawn from both Jungian psychology and ancient wisdom traditions. First, conscious retention. The 1% practice periods of complete sexual conservation, not from repression, but from redirection. They understand that semen contains not just reproductive cells, but vital energy. While science is only beginning to study this, these men know from experience that retention leads to heightened energy, focus, creativity, and magnetic presence. Second, physical transmutation. When sexual energy builds, they don't suppress it. They redirect it through intensive physical training. This isn't casual exercise. It's concentrated effort that moves energy from the sexual centers throughout the body. Activities like intense strength training, martial arts, or endurance work serve as alchemical processes that transform sexual energy into physical power. Third, creative channeling. The 1% have creative rituals that direct this conserved energy into productive output. They write, build, design, strategize, lead, not as occasional activities, but as daily disciplines. Jung would call this sublimation, the process of directing libidinal energy toward non-sexual, culturally valued aims. Fourth, meditation and breathwork. These men use specific meditation techniques that circulate sexual energy rather than releasing it. Through breathwork, visualization, and attention, they guide this energy up the spine to energize the heart, mind, and higher consciousness. Jung himself studied Eastern practices that work with this energy, which he saw as central to psychological integration. Fifth, purpose alignment. The 1% connect their sexual discipline to a greater purpose, something beyond themselves. This creates a powerful feedback loop. Their purpose gives meaning to their discipline, and their discipline gives energy to their purpose. Jung called this the individuation process, becoming who you truly are meant to be. What's critical to understand is that these aren't separate techniques but an integrated lifestyle. The 1% don't just practice retention, they simultaneously channel that energy into creation. They don't just exercise, they consciously direct sexual energy through movement. They don't just meditate, they circulate and elevate their creative force. But there's a deeper psychological dimension that Jung would emphasize. These practices work not just on a physical level, but by integrating the conscious and unconscious mind. When a man directs his sexual energy consciously, he's actually bringing unconscious drives under the guidance of awareness, a process Jung saw as essential to psychological wholeness. Most men never experience this integration because they remain reactive to their impulses, creating a split between their conscious goals and unconscious drives. The 1% heal this split through conscious energy management, aligning what they want with what they do. This integration creates an unusual level of personal power that others can sense but rarely understand. Now I want you to participate. After hearing these practices, which one resonates with you most? Which could you implement immediately? Your answer could be the beginning of awareness, the first step toward joining the 1% who have discovered that sexual energy, properly directed, is the most powerful creative force available to man. Before you go, an important notice. Mastering sexual energy isn't about denial or repression, it's about conscious direction. It's not about never experiencing pleasure, it's about choosing when and how to use your most precious resource. It's about creation over consumption, building over depleting, and legacy over momentary satisfaction. The 1% aren't superhuman. They've simply discovered what Jung pointed to decades ago, that there is a direct connection between how you manage your sexual energy and what you achieve in life. You have the same energy available to you right now. The only question is, what will you create with it?